Hey class, welcome to Unit 4 and Chapter 13. This is the first lecture for Unit 4. And Unit 4 is really all about how the diversity of life on this planet developed. When we look at all of the different life forms that we have that inhabit planet Earth right now, how did they get here? How did they change over time? And what is our model for how life arose on this planet. So we're going to start at the beginning, if you will, and talk about how change can happen. And in order to understand how change can happen, we really need to go back to, I think this was like one of our very first slides in the entire course. Like back when we were in person, we were all young and optimistic about life. We'd never heard of coronavirus yet. And so we were all, it was a different world, right? It seems so long ago, right? But this is one of the first slides that we had. And it was really about, it was really about how living things are organized in terms of systems. So if we start at the, let's start at the bottom, like at the very smallest, we have atoms. Atoms come together to form larger molecules, and those molecules of life there's 4 of them, our lipids, our proteins, our carbohydrates, and our nucleic acids. And those are organized into the smallest unit that we would consider alive, and of course that's a cell. There are some organisms that are unicellular, like bacteria, right? A single cell makes up an entire living thing. And of course we're made up of millions and millions, or billions, I should say, billions and billions of cells ourselves. And our cells are organized into tissues. Those tissues are organized into organs. We have organ systems and so on. And that brings us to our next kind of unit of life. And of course, that's the organism itself. So multicellular organisms are called organisms, and we have different species that differentiate traits from other species. Now, if we take organisms and we have one type of organism, and this is going to become important later, and this is why I want to stress the population. So we're right here. Oh, I have my handy little pen right here. We're right here. A population is a specific species living in a specific area. So if we were to go down to the Everglades in Florida and look at a particular, I don't know, there might be more than one kind of alligator. Let's suppose there's only one kind of alligator that lives there. We would call that community, that group of alligators living in the Everglades a population. So it's a community of, I just did it again. It's a group of alligators living in a particular geographical area. Now, on the other hand, we have the term community, and we're going to talk about communities in Unit 5. And communities are all the living things in that particular ecosystem. So here you can see that it's not just the alligators, it's also, that looks like some type of egret or heron that's also in the swamps of the Everglades, the plants, all the aquatic species, and so on. So a community consists of any living thing that is contained within an ecosystem. And then of course we can go one step higher into an ecosystem. An ecosystem not only comprises all of the organisms, so all the living things, but also all the non-living things. Of course, the big one being, of course, water, the soil, rocks, and so on. So, and it's the interaction of all the elements in a particular geographical area. Those ecosystems can be contained within a biosphere. And of course, the next biggest thing from a biosphere is our planet, our ship that is hurtling through space. So we can organize all of these units of organization in terms of smallest to biggest. So our smallest is an atom. Our biggest is of course, our planet. We're going to learn this in Unit 5. I want to say there's maybe like 7 different biospheres. I might have made that number up. I think that's how many continents we have. I forget, but we have lots of biospheres. We're going to talk about that in Unit 5. So when we think about what's the difference between this guy and this guy? Okay, it's basically the same thing. Good. Okay, so I'll go ahead and skip to this slide. So when we talk about the process of change, in other words, how life changes over time. And when I say over time, we're talking about thousands and thousands of years, even millennia, over millions of years. How does this change occur? Well, it happens at 3 different levels of organization. It really happens at the level of the population. And that's why I said that term is so important that to understand the term population, because change occurs at the population level. This is where we study it and this is where we observe it. But where it really happens ultimately is at the level of the atom, because ultimately all change comes from our genes. And the only way that our genes can change, there's really ultimately the only way that our genes can change is through mutation. But another way that our genes can undergo change would be through sexual selection, right? The combination of two different people's set of genes and them coming together to form a new organism. So we really talk about this change at three different levels: at the molecular genetics level with atoms and mutations in our DNA, at the level of the organism, at the level of the organism here, because this is where we see those changes occur. If we have a mutation in a particular protein, we can see a phenotypic change within a particular organism, and then we can count that change. We can see how many organisms exhibit that trait within a population. So three different kind of levels to this study of evolution. So we call this, and this is a big idea in biology. This is one of the major concepts that all biologists kind of adhere to and pride themselves in and talk about. And this is called the modern synthesis. And the modern synthesis really linked these three levels. So we have, remember, we haven't talked about Darwin yet, but Darwin kind of came first. He had these ideas of how animals, how should I say, the traits that living things have. And he had those in about the mid-1800s, mid-19th century. And then we had Mendel come along in the 1860s, so a little bit later, who kind of put forward this idea of inheritance, this idea that traits are these individual kind of undividable units that are passed from parent to offspring, and how those units are inherited. And then it wasn't until 1950 that we had the idea of chromosomes, and that they were truly molecules and atoms that were causing these changes to be happening. So it wasn't until not that long, again, this was only about 50 years ago, that we had really a good kind of top to bottom idea of how populations and organisms can undergo change through this mechanism of mutation and sexual selection. It's called the modern synthesis. And we're going to talk quite a bit about this. Now, I mean, we've already talked about inheritance and sexual selection, but now what we're going to do is talk about how those manifest in a population. So let's see if you can figure out your understanding of the term population. So which of these, looks like 5 options here, describe a population? Well, let's see. Which one is it? So let's start at the bottom. And again, let's just talk about why the wrong answers are wrong, because I hope that that helps a little bit. If we think about why E is incorrect, we're talking about more than one kind of bird. Remember, a population is a specific species in a specific geographical area. So even though, so if E had changed to, what's a common bird around here that migrates? I don't know Western birds very well. Actually, I just saw a Western bluebird the other day. I'm kind of a bird person. Back when I lived in the Midwest, I did a lot of bird watching, because it was always a big event in the spring. The birds came back and it meant winter was over. And all of you out here, you have endless summer. So there's no sense, you will never know the sense of joy when you have the first 75-degree day after a really long winter. It's really a fun thing. And when that came, a lot of birds, right? As soon as it started to get warm, all the birds would come back. And so it was a big deal in the Midwest to see the birds come back. So I'm not so good at the birds out here, because they're all different, because they're separated by the Rocky Mountains. But I did see a Western bluebird for the first time yesterday. I put it in my little bird diary. And I'm admitting to be a big nerd right now, and that's fine. I saw a Western bluebird the other day. I'm fairly confident that they are migratory, right? So if the answer for E had changed to Western bluebirds are traveling further north due to increased temperatures associated with climate change, that would be a good example of a population, because we're talking about a specific population of a specific species. And yes, they might move from one area to the next, but we're looking at their behavior and how they behave as a group. Let's see, what's wrong with D? An individual sea turtle can migrate over 1,000 miles in the year. Again, populations mean a group. So if we were to talk about a specific kind of sea turtle, like a leatherback sea turtle, or a green sea turtle, or what's the Magellan sea turtle, I think they're called, or the there's a specific kind of sea turtle that you can actually see around here every once in a while. So we were talking about that particular group that migrates up and down the western coast of California. That answer would be true, but this answer is incorrect because it states an individual. This word right here makes it incorrect. Option C talks about all the mammals. Again, not correct. We're talking about a very specific group of animals. And again, when they mention the meerkat, we're only talking about one. So we need a population, and not only that, but a zoo, I don't know, I might be parsing words a little bit, but these animals aren't in their natural habitat, right? They're really living biological specimens that are put on display for people to learn and be entertained by. B, palm trees grow faster in climates without annual frost. Well, that is true. I'm sure that's palm trees die in climates that have frost. But again, we're talking about comparing palm trees in, say, Florida with palm trees that are further north, say maybe North Carolina. They probably occasionally have a minor frost or something. So we're comparing a population. We're comparing two different populations, palm trees in Florida versus palm trees in North Carolina. So that leaves us with a specific only one answer left, and that's A. And we're talking this is our correct answer because we're talking about a specific area. So if you're not familiar, Florida Canyon is one of the canyons in Balboa Park. This is where we would have went for a walk and a tour of the local plant species had we still been in person. But it's a canyon and it's fairly isolated because animals that live in these canyons tend not to leave, right? They kind of stay in their own little ecosystem, if you will. And so in this particular ecosystem, Florida Canyon, you can do a survey and count how many field mice live in this particular canyon. So we could say that 37 male field mice live in Florida Canyon. All right, whoops, what did I do? Discard. I might keep. Let's keep that. Why did it? Oh, sorry. Let me fix that really quick. I must have accidentally hit escape. Okay, so we know what a population is. Again, specific species living in a specific area that's isolated from other areas. So we could talk. Let me think of a good example. Crows, I guess crows would be a decent enough example. Crows move around a lot. They usually stick, at least in San Diego, right? They kind of more or less stay in the area. So we could talk about the crows that live within the city or kind of within the county. So we're really talking about, no, here's an even better one. Let's think about a pond. All the, is there even a pond? Or like, where's a lake around here? Otay Mesa Lake, I think. I'm pretty sure that's a lake, right? And so if there's fish in that lake, that particular fish, let's say, I want to say catfish. I'm from the Midwest. Let's just imagine that there's a particular kind of catfish that lives in Otay Mesa Lake. That would be considered population because those fish are around one another and can interbreed with one another and fight one another for food and resources and mates and so on. So that population is distinct from the next lake that's just, 5 miles away, 10 miles away, because they don't intermix with one another. So with birds, it gets really tricky because birds are migratory. Birds can have a very large habitat range. I don't know if you know this, but there are some species of birds that migrate from like Alaska to Chile every year. I mean, they literally fly like thousands and thousands of miles twice a year. So they have these huge ranges of what they would consider their home territory or their home turf. So what we're trying to do again is just kind of define a population as a group of species, group of organisms within a particular species that can interact with one another. So now let's define the idea of evolution. And evolution is a really charged word. A lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about what this term evolution means. And it really means something very specific to biologists. And so let's talk about that, but let's introduce the concept first. So here we have a population of individuals. It looks like we have about 10 individuals. And the allele for purple hair is capital P. And the allele for yellow hair is lowercase p. So that's the recessive allele. So you can see that the purple hair allele is dominant to the yellow hair allele. Remember that dominant versus recessive doesn't necessarily mean there's more of it in a population. It just simply means which one is going to be displayed if you're heterozygous. So if we were to look at the phenotype of this population, remember that phenotype is the physical manifestation of those genes. So if we get an allele from our mother and an allele from our father, what will our phenotype look like? So if you count up the number of purple-haired individuals in this group and yellow-haired individuals, you can see that the phenotype frequency for purple hair is 7 out of 10 or 70%. Yellow hair is 3 of 10 or 30%. So this is called the phenotype frequency. We're looking at that physical trait and seeing how many people have it. But now let's look at allele frequency. In other words, what is the allele distribution in this population? And in order to do that, we actually have to look at the gene pool. So if we were somehow able, and we can actually do this fairly easily now with how advanced and fast and quick and cheap molecular genetics is, right? In San Diego, there's this really cool company called Illumina, and they were kind of one of the premier companies that started this really fast way of sequencing DNA. And they brought in this new era really of DNA sequencing and made it really cheap to look at genes now. And so we can actually do this for a population. So we did it for this group of individuals. And you can see that we now know what the gene pool is. And again, the gene pool is going to be every copy of every allele in every member of the population. So we can see all of the alleles for each individual now. So if we were to count up the dominant allele, remember capital P, we would put that number here, right? And if we were to count up the recessive alleles, we would put that number, of course, here. So go ahead and do that for yourself and see if you agree with me. I think I have it here. You'll see that there are 10 dominant alleles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 10 lowercase alleles or recessive alleles in this population. So the allele frequency here is going to be 10 out of 20 for each. In other words, there's an even distribution of alleles in this population. Not necessarily what you would have expected. You would have expected maybe more purple hair or dominant alleles because there's more individuals with purple hair. So the phenotype frequency and the allele frequency are not going to be the same. That's a common misconception when people are looking at change in population. So phenotype frequency and allele frequency, two different things. So if that allele frequency changes, so here we have 50-50, right? The capital P to lowercase p ratio is 50 to 50, 50% to 50%. But now we're going to change it. Notice these two. Where are they? Right here, right? These two guys right here. Their phenotype, or I'm sorry, their allele is going to change. So they went from homozygous dominant to heterozygous now. So notice that the allele frequency changed from 50 to 50 to now it's 40-60. This is change over time. Evolution is change in allele frequency in a population over time. Evolution just occurred in this group of individuals. So this particular, and so again, here's another kind of common misconception with evolution is that we should be able to see the change. Notice that when we look at these, look at this difference here, we have 50%, 50-50 allele distribution, and we have 7 of 10 have purple hair and 3 of 10 have yellow hair. We changed that allele distribution to 40-60, but notice that the phenotype frequency didn't change. There's still 7 people with purple hair and 3 people with yellow hair. So evolution here only acted, or I shouldn't say only acted, the only change here was in allele frequency, but that's still change over time. But now let's look at a different one, right? So we have now another generation, and let's look at our allele distribution here. We now see that our allele distribution has changed even more dramatically. It's 25% to 75%. And now we have a fairly dramatic effect on phenotype frequency. So evolution can occur in both cases. So it's a change in allele frequency over time, and that allele frequency can have an effect on the phenotype, but it doesn't have to. Both of them are cases, both of them are examples of evolution occurring. So let's take a step back and talk about how evolution occurred. So and again, I'm just going to go back to this slide really quick, because I just want to point out that this is the definition of evolution: change in allele frequency in a population over time. If that's occurring, evolution is occurring. So let's take a step back and think about how we got to here. And the idea of, so first of all, the idea that evolution even occurs, that that species can change over time, is a fairly new concept. It's really only about 150 years old. For the longest time, even scientists believed that that species were fixed, that they don't change. Excuse me. And that they fit in distinct categories or classifications. And then there started to be some, so farmers knew this wasn't true, right? Farmers knew this wasn't true. Gardeners, people that bred animals, knew that that wasn't true, because they could change the animals that they bred, or the plants that they bred, over time. They could see that they were changing. And so as this idea that there was change became more popular, there were various reasons for that. There were various kind of ideas that came forward. One idea was Lamarck's theory of transmutation, and basically this said that basically we're evolving towards complexity. In other words, as generations move forward, we get more and more complicated because we're passing on these acquired traits. In other words, what we do during our lifetime, we can pass on to our offspring. And this has been proven not to be true. Our genes are fixed, and what we do during our lifetime doesn't really change the sequence of those genes. Now, it could affect the expression of those genes, but it doesn't affect what genes will pass on to our offspring. And of course, this was not a very popular idea and didn't gain a lot of traction. And of course, we now also know that it's wrong. But it was a step in the right direction. At least scientists by then, excuse me, started thinking about the possibility that living things weren't fixed, and in terms of their ability to change and adapt to their environment. So it wasn't until the mid to late 1800s that we first had kind of a breakthrough paper put forward, or a book put forward, and that was, of course, Charles Darwin and oh my goodness, I forget his first name. The other major scientist was Wallace, and I can't. It's in the book. Let me quick look up his name. Wallace. I should know this. I'm very ashamed of myself right now. All populations evolve. Alfred Russel Wallace. So Darwin and Wallace were really the first. They both came out with these really seminal pieces of work in the mid 1850s, I want to say, and kind of put forward this idea that organisms change based on pressure from their environment. And so that's really what we're going to talk about here for the rest of this lecture. So we're going to focus on Darwin. Darwin usually gets most of the credit. But I just wanted to mention Alfred Russel, I think is his middle name. I have it right here. Yep. How do I remember his middle name, but not his first name? Alfred Russel Wallace was the other scientist that doesn't get nearly as much credit as he should, because he was really an important contributor to this idea as well. So we have fairly solid geologic evidence that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and there have been layers of sediment that have built up over time. And we know this now because of this geological track record, but in the 1800s, the predominant idea or the predominant story about the planet at that time was that the Earth is around 6,000 years old. And of course, we now know that that's not true. And we have fossil evidence and carbon dating, and we can look at the magnetic structure of rocks in this strata to say that we know that this is not true, and that in fact we have we can find fossil after fossil that shows that are much older than 6,000 years old. Some of them are millions of years old, and in fact we see fossils that are even billions of years old. We think that the first kind of living thing, the first thing that we would consider living, there's some evidence around 3 to 3.5 billion years ago. And we also know that the deeper into the planet that we get, in other words, the deeper into those sedimentary layers that we get, the older those fossils. So we kind of have this idea that, as the Earth kind of grew over time and changed over time, that some of the living things became fossilized. And so the deeper in the sedimentary layers that we go, the older the fossils are. Makes sense. So now let's talk about old Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin, he's yet another fascinating kind of story in his own right. He was unlike Mendel, who was born on a farm and did not have means and had to join a monastery to kind of be left alone and do his work. Charles Darwin was actually born into a fairly privileged family and was kind of a bon vivant. Like, he didn't have much to do, and he didn't show, he wanted to study nature, and he liked to kind of examine the rocks and the fossils and all the living things in the creek beds and ponds around his family's estate. But he didn't have any, real ambition. His father tried to turn him into, I think, a physician. He didn't like blood. He thought it was barbaric. And so then his father was like, well, maybe you should go into the clergy. And then he went to Cambridge. And so he was just kind of one of these privileged rich kids in Britain that got to kind of do whatever he wants. So his father's like, okay, you're going on this ship. and Darwin was like, this is amazing. I can do this. And he was gone for 5 years. And he basically joined this ship called the HMS Beagle on a trip around the world. And Darwin was all about it. He was in his element because every time they stopped, he would basically jump off the ship and collect all of these specimens. He found fossils. He took drawings and pressings of all the plant species that he found. And he collected any living thing that he could kill and get his hands on. He took a specimen of, and he did this all around the world. Specifically, I want to point out a series of islands off of the western coast of South America called the Galapagos Islands. And I'm sure you've heard of them. Very, very famous set of islands because of Charles Darwin. So what his main observation was that the plants, basically the flora and fauna, right? The living things, the plants and animals that were in an area were really determined by the geographic, I got another phone call. Oh my gosh. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to pause. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. I sent out, I'm just getting lots of student emails and student calls today and text messages. That's okay. Sorry for the interruption. Okay. So if we go back to Darwin, right, he's traveling all over the world, and he starts to form this idea that the living things in an area, so their proximity to other living things is a better predictor of relationships than the similarity of environment. In other words, I'm going to read this right out of the book because it's kind of tricky. So let's see here. The plants and animals living in temperate regions of South America more closely resemble the species living in tropical regions of that same continent rather than the temperate regions of Europe, for example. So in other words, he knew that, broadly speaking, in a particular, for example, so all of the plants and animals, why isn't this working? There we go. Okay. All of so where would be a temperate region? So a temperate region of South America is going to be around here. And so you would think that because they have a similar environment to, say, another temperate region like Northern Europe, for example, You would think that you would find the same plants and animals in both cases because they have the same amount of rainfall, same amount of temperature changes and so on. But what really happened is that the animals and plants here more closely resembled the animal and plants that were close to them. In other words, geographic proximity is a better indicator of a relationship than similarity of environment. He also looked at finches, so the famous finches of the Galapagos Islands. So we had this finch, this original species of finch, now long extinct. He found fossil evidence, or he didn't find fossil evidence, but others have found fossil evidence of this original species of finch that was on the mainland, so in South America. And as it progressed through these islands, they settled in the different islands of the Galapagos. And what we can see here is that each of these finches, all of these different finches, are really descendants of this original finch and have some similarity, again, because they're geographically, they're close geographically to that original finch ancestor. And because this happened, oh goodness, I'm trying to think when they think that this island hopping first happened. I want to say it was millions of years ago. So this original bird first migrated into these onto these islands millions of years ago, and as they made their way to other islands, they accumulated these adaptations to fit each particular environment. So for example, this island that's really small has a very different environment than this island that is really big, and so on. So you can see this in the finches. The most obvious, of course, is the different kinds of beaks that these different finches have. So we can see this again. So as we progress through time, right, here's our time. This is, again, millions of years. We can see that not only did these birds change over time, but they changed in response to what, in this case, what they ate. We can see here that we have finches that ate mostly insects, buds, so young flowers. We have finches that eat cactus, and we have finches that eat seeds. And so, of course, we know that seed eaters are going to have a really strong beak. Look at these beaks on here compared to, especially compared to warblers eat insects, right? Tiny little insects. You don't need a really strong beak to eat insects and so on. So we can see very distinct differences between birds that, based on what they eat. And again, as I mentioned before, farmers knew this a long time ago. Farmers knew, and people that bred plants and animals know that we can see descent with modification due to basically the way that we kind of change which two parents decide, mate to produce offspring, right? I mean, this is basically what Mendel did, right? He decided which pea plants to cross to make offspring. So I'm sure most of you know this, but all of these plants are really the same species. And so they've just been selected for different qualities over time. They're all descendants of a really, actually very invasive and harmful plant, the wild mustards. Wild mustard grows everywhere. In fact, there's a story, it's all over San Diego, and I don't even know if there's a place on the planet where it's not, but it's an incredibly tough plant, and the seeds last forever. And there's a story, and I don't know if it's true or not, but the Spaniards, when they were traveling, like when they were trying to basically, what's the word? Claim the new world for Spain. Everywhere, every port that they stopped in, or every new continent or area that they stopped in, they would spread wild mustard seeds so that everyone knew where they had already been. So it was kind of a way of marking the territory for Spain. So the Spaniards basically spread this invasive species all over the planet as they explored the New World. But we, again, think about how different all of these plants are in terms of their characteristics and their observable traits. They're all the same. They're all the same plant. They come from the same wild mustard plant, and because over time they have been selected by gardeners for specific characteristics. So Darwin gets back from his I think he was gone for like 5 or 6 years, and decides to write a book, and he started to form this idea. First, it became very clear to him that there was no way the planet was 6,000 years old. That's just flat out not true. It was actually much, much older than that. And he realized that species do in fact change, because he had this really clear fossil evidence of all of these fossils that were really old and resembled the species that were there in present day, but had some type of modification to them. So they were kind of like related to, you know, like they looked kind of like the species that were alive at the time, but there was some difference. So he had this idea that species can change and that the selective agent is nature itself. So this idea that species populations are going to change over time, and that they're really going to change in response to their environment. Now, this was a big deal. Like, this doesn't sound like a big deal to us. All of us kind of understand this at a very kind of basic level. But this was a big deal to Darwin because he came from a very well-to-do British family. And at the time, it was dominated, right, the society was much more religious, and the idea that God didn't make a perfect species and that there were other species and that we can change and it's really all left up to chance and nature was heretical at the time. So he came back, he wrote this book, and then he sat on it for like, I want to say like close to 20 years. And the only reason that he ended up publishing it was because Alfred Wallace was kind of coming up with the same ideas, and he wanted to, and I think the time, you know, in that 20 years, he kind of came to terms with it and grew up, of course, as a person as well, and decided to publish this book. And of course, that book is The Origin of Species by, what's the long title of the, Origin of Species by the Process of Natural Selection. What is it? I know it's in. Where is it? Oh, here it is. Yeah. So the long title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And of course, most people just call it The Origin of Species. I had to read it when I was in college. It's actually a really interesting book. And it was very well written also. But of course, one of the major, if we had a shelf of all the major biology books, that book would 100% be on that shelf. Very, very important book to push forward this idea of evolution by natural selection. And it really, I think, one of the things that's so cool about this idea is that it brings together the central theme of this course and really of biology, and that's unity and diversity. We're all the same, but we're all different, right? We have very diverse ways. We have these similarities. We all have DNA. We all have these life processes. We're all organized in a similar fashion, but the manifestations of those changes and how that DNA is expressed is very different. And that's a really cool idea. And if you fall in love with that idea, you should be a biologist. All right, so let's look at some current lines of evidence for evolution. And again, these aren't that different from what Darwin did himself. Of course, the fossil record itself. So seeing that the fossils in an area, if you've ever been, I haven't been yet because I've been so busy. So I just moved out here, just I guess in August, it'll be 2 years. And I keep wanting to go, and I was going to go this summer, and I hope I can. But there's this really cool area up near LA. It's called the La Brea Tar Pits. And they actually have a mini La Brea tar pit at the San Diego Zoo. And it's kind of this really cool thing. Basically, it's really sad to think about, but it was basically this tar pit that living things would fall into and die. And they would become fossilized. And it's become a gold mine for fossils. So we can see that that ancient Southern California actually used to look a lot like Africa. There were lions and major huge animals that of course are extinct now today, but the fossil record shows us in many areas of the world that the species that are fossilized and there resemble somewhat the species that are there presently. And of course now Darwin couldn't do this, but now we can date those carbonized fossils by looking at the amount of carbon isotopes they have. We can kind of get a rough idea. And if any of you do any kind of hiking, if you go hike in any of the canyons or washes in this area, you can actually see a lot of fossils in the canyons themselves. You can see a lot of clams and snails and shell formations because most of this area used to be underwater. We can also look at the comparative anatomy. This is actually a class, if you become a biology major, many universities require you to take a comparative anatomy class, where you're basically comparing the anatomical structures of different categories of animals. Here we can see that, for example, we're looking at mammals. Mammals have the same bones. It's really interesting to think about, like, we essentially have the same bone structure as a whale, but those bones have adapted very differently in a whale population versus us. Another cool and kind of, I've always felt like this is kind of creepy, but our embryos look very similar. So if you look at very, very kind of young embryos, like a month, 2 months old, they look very similar to the embryos of other species that are related to us. So the closer our embryos look to one another, then the more closely related we are to that particular species. And of course, now with the advent of DNA technology, we can look at molecular biology and actually look at our own DNA. So in the same way that we can look at our brother and our sister and see that we have a certain amount of DNA homology, and then we were to look at our cousin, we still have homology with them, but less so, right? And then we look at our second cousin, and if you kind of keep extending that family tree out, you can see that the similarities in our DNA start to go down. And that's in fact what we see for all species on this planet. We're all related. It's just you kind of have to think about how far back in time you're willing to go to look at that relatedness. So let's look at homology. You can see this is just a little bit closer of an examination of those bone structures, right? We all have the bones in our, this would be considered our forelimb, right? We have a humerus, the radius and ulna. We have a two bone forearm, and then what would be called our hand, of course, has 3 layers: our carpals, our metacarpals, and our phalanges. All mammals have this bone structure. They have just kind of adapted again over time in a population to serve different functions in these different animals. And then this will kind of blow, I think this is pretty wild. In terms of our genes, we share 84% of our genes are identical to a mouse. So we're 84% related to a mouse. We're 84% related to a chicken. Who knew? And then like we can get really down here low at fruit flies. 68% of our genes are identical to a fruit fly. I think that's pretty incredible. So ask yourself this question. What does the similarity in bone structure suggest? So the correct answer here is B. We all 4 of these are all mammals, right? Humans, cats, whales, and bats. And all 4 of us have a common ancestor, if we go back far enough in time, that had these same bones. And again, it doesn't mean anything else other than that. So we share basically what's called a common descent. Okay, so let's get back to Darwin on his big voyage of discovery. So Darwin had 2 major observations, and then he had 2 inferences based on those observations that form the basis of natural selection as a mechanism of evolution. So let's talk about the observations first. He noticed that when he looked at a particular population in any given area, that there's variation among that population. And of course, we all understand this, and we can see it here demonstrated in this picture. We have a bunch of ladybugs on a branch, and we can see that those ladybugs have different traits in terms of the coloration of their shell, how red or orange it is, and then the spots that are on that shell. Are they big spots? Are they small? Are they dark? Are they light? And so on. So we have some variation in traits. Again, we all know this, right? If we were to look at all the fish in that otay, or all the catfish, I can pretty much guarantee you Otay Mesa Lake does not have catfish in it, but whatever kind of fish it is, we can look at those fish and we can see a variation in their traits. All right, observation number 2. And so if the first one's obvious to you, the second one is usually not as obvious to students. And you might think you understand this, but I don't think students really appreciate how harsh and how cruel nature is. The reality is that the vast majority of things that are born or the things that are germinated in terms of plants, right, die very soon. They never make it to adulthood. Nature is rough, right? It's really hard to survive in a natural environment, and this is also one of the reasons why I kind of stress you don't want to think about human examples when we talk about evolution, because we're in a way we're almost outside of it, right? We can't. There's a lot of things that don't necessarily we can't. We have a hard time interpreting for the human population because we break so many rules, basically. But if we were to think about pretty much any other animal or any other population of living thing on this planet, the vast majority of the offspring that parents produce the environment can't support all of those offspring. So they are either preyed upon by predators, they die of disease, they die of starvation, right? There's all kinds of ways that these animals die and fail to survive to adulthood and then therefore reproduce. So those are the 2 observations that Darwin made. And I'm going to cut off this lecture here so that you have so that I can start uploading this. I'm realizing that I have to keep them below 15 minutes and somebody is being super loud out there and I have to figure out what that is. And I will be back with part 2.